Hello everyone, today we talk about arms and manpower of the 30 Years' War. I confess that before studying medieval history, I wanted to study ancient one at university, and the reason why I couldn't is what brought me to be a medievalist, right? But if I couldn't have been a medievalist either, and I'm not explaining, by the way, why I couldn't be an anarchist before, I would have been a modernist and likely would have focused on the 17th century. I say likely because you may never know how it's really going to end, but part of the reason why I really wanted this was studying this war in the, say, dramatic, catalytic capacity it had, right, in pushing Europe towards a more modern, at what it's recognized at least as such, dimension, politically, militarily, socially, right? This is not just a German history, of course, it's a European history as a whole, mostly having to do, yes, with Central Europe and a very specific type, in fact, of local culture, mostly federal in nature, at least emerging from feudal origin like that, confirmed right through the failure of the Habsburgs, so that, you know, if you do not come from that background, it's not easy to understand, admittedly, and that's the reason why I really want to talk about not just the 30 Years' War, but about modern warfare and history more, right? I have really a inexhaustible arsenal of topics, of videos to make here. And the impression is that the 30 Years' War is one of the preferential paths to a reconsideration, at least of the relation between modernity and tradition, what was at stake there. So today we can't simply talk about that. We will talk about armies, let's say their quality, also on a national base, what was the background to it, manpower, who were the people who fought in the 30 Years' War on average, how they were levied, what's about that. I made lots of videos about early modern warfare in general that deal with, say, Renaissance Europe, the mercenaries, say their background, their moral values, etc. So we are no strangers to that, but again, it always feels I don't do enough about that. I'm going to just stop discussing now the fact that I want at least to talk more frequently about this war. But say a couple of months ago we saw the Battle of Freiburg. Towards the end of the 30 Years' War, we had some chance to look a bit more in 17th century warfare. We will keep doing so, aside from now also the 30 Years' War, which was fought by armies, which in fact really embodied that aforementioned transition, right? You could think of them very simplistically as a sort of half medieval and half modern way, which it's not incorrect, right? But just one has, if anything, to understand what we mean there by tradition and modernity, which is also not what I'm going to do now. But as you know, I made multiple videos on the topic specifically. You can go check those out. But in a strictly organizational sense, the definition is valid, because from one side you have still essentially a feudal and truly traditional background. You have essentially some monarchies. You have, first of all, the empire that is not recognized, as you know, much as a universal authority, especially after the Protestant Reformation, but the decline of universal authorities is something we have seen very often, say, from a theoretical and political point of view in the videos about essentially starting from the 14th century. But these powers were based naturally on the notion of a individual quality that had to be the highest in the case of sovereigns, for the simple fact that this would be the only way for which anybody would obey them in the first place. And this, as you know, gave birth to, say, very differently calibrated system. Think about the sense of distrust, or at least of regulation that the English had towards their sovereign. But still, at this point, could affirm an absolute monarchy of sort in the future of English history. But I also made lots of videos about the English Civil War, admittedly not much about politics, just about the military, etc. But that also has a lot to do with it. I mean, the way the English army was at this point, and how the new model army emerged, and why, what for, etc. is one of the great themes, as you know, in say modern European history, as much as the prelude to, say, the British Empire in the first place, etc. As opposed to France, where since the late Middle Ages, or even before, like the monarch was fundamentally attributed certain prerogatives that allowed him, if not to overstep the parliament, at least to promulgate laws on his own wherever a gap, or say the juridical notion of it was identified, like in order to really tighten, right, to strengthen the state, right, because especially at the beginning of the 16th century, and increasingly during the 17th, during the 30 Years' War under Richelieu and Mazzarino, but even more under the Sun King, of course, would evolve towards, but that, in fact, that more modern profile, right, that should be, as I always refer to, really looked at from Louis XIV onwards as the real, say, I don't like the term, even in this case, but real military revolution. That would be followed properly by the French Revolution. At that point, in Napoleonic terms, we've seen being really yet another scale, but like for the rest of Europe, really from the Middle Ages to now, as we were pointing out, that the system had remained somehow very similar to before. And it consisted, again, in the clienterly power that the monarch had towards the nobility, that was meant like for cohesion, for recognition of the same monarchical authority, and the obedience to it, to provide forces that, of course, were levied through also subcontracting system towards, or we'll see now that the business side of the story during the 30 Years' War took unprecedented proportion, even after a very long history. Think about the one of the condottieri, etc. Plus, of course, the old concept of the general levy of able-bodied freemen that any, in fact, subject was eligible for, and that, however, happened mostly through also this hierarchy of power, through, say, nobility at times, their contractors, etc. The most important, say, development from the Renaissance onward had been the affirmation, which is, however, also rooted in the Middle Ages and even before, if we really want to be precise, objectively, in the creation of some permanent forces that, of course, were still levied throughout all the Ancien regime according to the same principles that we observed, but that for the first time after a very long one, you can look at Roman times, etc., were fundamentally a permanent military of a substantial scale, right? A substantial size, which cost a lot, but offered essentially this professional character to those who would be part of it. The elite was just militarized as such, so those would normally receive the command posts in virtue of their nobility. So receiving money from the one that the monarch was already given by the estates in general, but specifically to train, to keep those forces that still, yes, were permanent, but didn't have fully developed all the, system, for example, of barracks, right, of statal armories and so on. Also because money was often, really a rare commodity, even for the most powerful states. And this caused essentially the size of these statal forces, we can say, to be relatively modest. Fundamentally, the majority of the armies were made up of mercenary companies that were contracted just like it had always been the case, and very often were commanded by people of noble blood still, because that's what the especially the lower nobility had ventured in during the gradual stratification and hierarchical gapping, let's say, of their estate over time, for which, of course, certain noblemen had become very powerful, while the majority remaining under, right, in this ever more structured ancien regime hierarchy, and that were very often the very best, right? The say, we can't call the saddle forces, which is not correct, because the state was not really the term did exist, but it was not so specifically institutional and juridical as especially what would be formed only in the 19th century with the Code Napoleon. But let's say this still royal forces, levied, say, equipped, trained in a centralistic fashion, were high in quality, right? They could also be hired in different ways, recruited in different ways. We will see now some differences, but they were at least provided with certain standards of uniformity that were, according also to the new, say, rationalistic insights, and of course, progress in mathematics, in logistics, in everything that now Western civilization was really accelerating in. And in fact, the 30 Years' War dramatically contributed to catalyze, as we were observing, were simply more effective on the battlefield. We have seen, for example, in the video about the Battle of Freiburg, what the French were capable of doing against, in that case, the Bavarians. The let's say the sense of rigor and standardized discipline and collective training that would simply send. That's not enough just per se, but just simply would make them attack, right, assault some fortified positions at incredibly high, with incredibly high losses, right, and simply keeping to grind the enemy that was mostly relying on this mix between mercenaries and militias, fundamentally, levies. And to a degree that from the other side they just wouldn't have, right? And that would in fact make it look like sort of patchy grouping of very heterogeneous units that reflected, in that case, compared to France, that was already substantially unitary, in spite of the problems that she also had to, say, Germany, the empire. So this incredibly still intricated forest of feudal privileges, of city-states, etc., that would resist a centralistic policy like the one that the Habsburgs wanted to finally carry out, in a sort of, say, compaction of Germany. You can say unification, because it sounds too teleological for what would happen just not so much later in time, a couple of centuries, but still, say, on a completely different political, institutional basis than this one. It's as if Central Europe still lived to an important degree in the Middle Ages, like most of Europe, admittedly. And what is fascinating, in fact, of Germany is that it was a land of contrast, where some of the most advanced lands in Europe there, as much as some of the most backwards. There was this very strong, it's the center of Europe. per se. So just it would mirror such central shade, right? This mix and paradoxes sometimes, but also dramatic forces that would trigger actually this this war, together with, of course, the prompts, the interventions, and the eventual disasters that followed. As you know, Germany is considered to have lost 1/3 of her population throughout the 30 Years' War, and there are beautiful works such as von Grimmelshausen's Simplicius Simplicissimus, for example, that literally opened your eyes about what Germany actually was at the time, which is something mind-blowing. It tells you like what Europe was in many ways up to just a couple of 100 years ago, right? And how we are still dramatically close to. So this, in my, say, periodization, things like modernity, subtle armies, etc., really begin with Louis XIV, right? The guy was just a child when the 30 Years' War ended, so we can't quite speak of the accomplishments of the French army at, say, at this point, in that true sense of modernity and statehood, right? But the process had actually already started, right? Even though France was still resembling, of course, one of the most advanced states in Europe, but also still a feudal country in many ways. Richelieu at some point was able to gather something like 100,000 men, with, again, great difficulties in a very unstandardized way, and with surely great things to fix. But this is the war that starts making all these countries, especially the protagonists of the war in Europe, realizing that something else, like a further step in civilization, was needed, with different outcomes, by the way. The empire had other problems, such as the Ottomans, that remain fundamentally out of the war. There will be actually a reflection after at the end of it, right, with an enormous amount of Ottoman purchase of all the overly produced masses of guns, of powder, etc., that would bring to an important, say, rearmament. Not that the Ottomans actually lacked still at that point in quality, contrarily to what is commonly believed as sort of technological, like the West took off technologically and the Ottoman army was just, backwards. Montecuccoli, after the Battle of the Rab, having seized the Ottoman camp, the first thing as it did was checking the quality of powder, which was basically at the time the single most important technological standard in firearms, in fact, technology. And he said, this stuff is excellent, right? And there is still, in fact, the sense of crusade, there's still the sense of a chivalric way of war. The 30 Years' War naturally is also embodying at its utmost the wars of religion, to the degree at least we intend, the confessional clashes of the early modern age. The end of the 30 Years' War would would reconfirm the principle of cuius regio eius religio that had stemmed fundamentally from the compromise followed to the Reformation, that had fragmented, or at least divided further Germany, right, in a time where the Habsburgs were already struggling against France and other powers to centralize more their power in Germany. It's a very complicated history that I'm sure most of you is well acquainted with. That's the reason why we will see this in completely different videos that from this. But it's important to understand what we're talking about in the nature of these armies. The ultimate goal would be the creation of a professional national military force, such as the one that the Sun King was able to affirm, creating fundamentally a dramatic headache to the rest of Europe that needed to coalesce against now this continentally hegemonic force. And this happens often in the history of France. And as opposed to the essentially mercenary and feudal armies of but a few generations before, really like armies were in late medieval warfare, really had substantially remained. They had increased in size. There had been substantial developments also in the central control of the resources. Artillery had brought massive logistical issues that require unprecedented bureaucratic capacities, etc. But and centralization, right? Because armies had been growing more punching, but the development had still maintained the basis of a mix between mercenaries, feudal levies, militias, and that's it practically. Plus this corps of royal forces that in many ways, of course, resembled this army. I mean, there weren't, of course, essential differences, for example, in from a tactical point of view, aside from the quality of the forces. These armies were to fight, like these units were to fight together, right, as a sole army on the battlefield. So the homogenization of these forces was obviously seen since the beginning. Since the dawn of warfare as what you would have to hopefully achieve to make things work in a never smoother way, right? This is also I made a video on it, the period of the staticization of siege warfare. There are lots of new insights of course, in gunpowder technology that are emerging, new fortresses design, etc. All the first step. We were still at the time of the Trace Italienne. Vauban also pertains to Louis XIV. Again, that's the big step, but it didn't happen overnight, right? There were lots of insights, a lot of, say, prodromes of ideas circulating, and having to do, of course, with the political, views on this war. This is, as we were saying before, like in parallel, you find the English Civil War. You have this debate over the rights of monarchs. There is this seditious, idea that fundamentally power can be stripped from what have been the traditional authorities, right? First the empire, plus the papacy. So Protestant countries would develop essentially a new political theory to legitimize the role of a monarch, fundamentally separated from the rest of Christendom, at least as far as his personal prerogatives as a head of state were concerned. Think about the English monarch as the head of the Anglican Church. So lots of answers had not been given yet to what this would have had to bring to it. It would never be given because the situation, say in a traditional sense, degenerated very fast. Also in the following 100 years. Think about the French Revolution, the rise of the Fourth Estate, etc. But let's say this disgregative process that very often is instead intended, especially by those countries who emerged strengthened by the war, a few, right? But still, at least in the reinforcement of their own local prerogatives, rights, and also confession are seen still by the respective national historiographies as the birth of that country. But in a traditional sense, that's the actual disgregation of the universal empire, right? Step after step from antiquity throughout these major fractures, such as especially the Reformation. and that, of course, respond to a double threat issue, right? They were not entirely a positive thing as much as they were not entirely a negative thing, right? There is a failure, if anything, of humanity entire for such things to have happened. And there was some, say, merit in the breaking in an individual sense, but also a collective failure, right, at another level. And so I will talk about this perhaps better in other days. Say, even at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, most of the major armies had already something of a national look to them, right? Since the 14th century, but even before, of course, with feudal monarchies and even before that, there had been a national dimension which had contributed to the development of the local polities, their militaries, and of course, for the sake also just of basic administration and other practical matters, of course, had been functioning as a cohesive characteristic, also from an ideological identity point of view. The finest Spanish outfits were those recruited in Spain herself. There is no doubt about this. While those recruited in subject lands were of lesser capacity. We'll see later, say, also perhaps a national placing in this sense, because certain nationalistic perspectives that belong to the age of the lesser people, at the Fourth Estate, they had barely to do with the concept of nation in tradition. Of course, are less obvious that our very poor culture nowadays has wanted certain peoples to be just stereotypically or not. Right? War is a very serious thing, and it depends on the very political and social characteristics of the time. It must be known in the first place historically and in a comparative diachronic way, as I always say. Otherwise, there can't be any concrete military analysis. So this was true with the armies of the Austrian Habsburgs, of the French, as we noticed, and of Sweden. More about all of them later. A few countries, most notably the Netherlands, about which I made some videos about the era, their military, relied very heavily on mercenary forces. Right, the Dutch preferred the navy to the army, and they would manage actually to create an excellent army. Right, between the end, especially the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, which was the best army in history in terms of cost-benefit ratio from an economical point of view. That were basically mercenaries, right? And so foreigners, so often, so that as we will see now, also their national forces were technically not that much, right? But their navy really was, and their mercenary army really was successful in maintaining Dutch independence and not making it essentially a Spanish or a French province, as you know. And when you look at countries like Saxony or Brandenburg, well, you still realize that they were able to call out considerable feudal levies, and that they were, in this sense, very, say, traditional. Let's put it this way. Of course, we cannot even digress minimally in the complexity of these countries' issues that mostly revolved, as you can expect, about the military and how to field a functional one, at least to prevent their land to be overrun, which, the 30 Years' War for Germany was quite a big as concrete deal. However, we can, as we will see now, appreciate the quality of these countries' forces. And the quality of the manpower which could be obtained depended naturally upon the efforts which were expended in its pursuit, and the cash, which comes from not a pre-existing situation, because you can have rich powers that, however, do not have necessarily the moral forces to create, say, successful armies, right? Which doesn't mean that they have to be. It's politics, right? It's about how driven you are, how morally loaded, determined you are to achieve a certain purpose. The Spanish had the best army, but they lost. In the Netherlands, they lost. Say in Germany, when they participated on the longer run, the cause of the Habsburgs was thwarted fundamentally. So, not necessarily having the best military is just the point, right? And military history shows you that all the time, because it's primarily a matter of continuation of politics, just with other means. So it only depends on that. Needless to say, even an essentially national army had to be paid, equipped, and transported like a very archaic feudal one, right? Nevertheless, on a general scale, it is possible to reconstruct what would appear to have been the preferred nationalities at the time for military service. Now, this is not a controversial, but still debatable topic, because we start having, from especially the Renaissance, where European warfare really began to be European to an unprecedentedly homogeneous scale, right? This was true for most, say, of Western Europe throughout the Middle Ages already. But let's say at this point in history, Europe gets intertwined to an unprecedented level, right? And as we've seen in other videos, mercenaries from very different countries could be found all on the same battlefield at a time. The 30 Years' War is quite telling of that. So this allows us to evaluate, in a general sense, at least on the basis of, say, what you can recognize as the military of that country, or at least contingents that were evidently national, or still from certain places, in general, what their quality really was. And there are lots of stories, anecdotes, jealousies, stereotypes that would depict that people like that or this in other way, but as you understand, they often change. This is not to say that, as you know, I'm not a moral relativist, that there wasn't an actual standard. But again, it's difficult to just do it on that chit-chat. You have to evaluate what happens on the battlefield. And that's something that really shows you certain characteristics that hopefully we'll in fact appreciate in further videos about single battles, campaigns of this war and others, and not just a sort of wishful thinking. So to make a brutal synthesis of that, as we were saying before, at the very top of the scale, there were the Spanish regulars, which may not be exactly the best definition, because, as you know, the famed tercio brigades were all volunteers. This was a huge deal. It had to do a lot with Spanish identity, pride. The reason why Spain had the best troops comes from different causes, of course. Spain had been dynastically unified at the end of the 15th century, just after this, mostly at that point, struggles again within the same Iberians, right? But that had finally expelled the Muslim presence from their peninsula after 700 years, and that had began also through the age of exploration and stepping to Italy, the Americas, Africa, etc., had continued this military tradition that was embodied in the guise, let's say, of 1/3 of the Castilian men being hidalgos, which was essentially a gentry that had developed in virtue of their military activity during the Reconquista, right? And so that bore this sense of sacred, right, mission. It's very difficult to just to summarize it in a few words. But if you, even through the satire of that, of Cervantes and the sense of this Spanish glory that was also part of the Dark Legion, at least, that was wanted to be made in the Protestant country, you understand what it feels like. These people had literally conquered an empire over which the sun never went down. Right? That's actually a quote, as you know, from Charles V that included Germany, but Naples and Austria are basically the same longitude, right? So that's not the point. The question being this enormous power that was drawing an enormous amount of precious metals from the Americas, and that was not an easy thing to do. Doesn't mean just free cash available. This caused enormous imbalances on the market. It would be, it's an incredibly complicated topic we'll treat on another occasion, but had allowed at least to just some of moral material forces to concentrate, right, to have this large manpower available, even though Spain was not dramatically populated. In fact, in the longer run, the cost was really felt, but that was enormously proud, right, and on the offensive and confident to step in all these countries, using also very harsh measures that were still, however, necessary if you look at the contingential circumstances in the Netherlands and so on. And that objectively embodied a great chunk of Catholic power that was providing for the general stability in Europe, preventing France to break through, to recreate de facto an empire, because that's what Francis I during the wars of Italy was up to, right? And also, albeit not as intensely as the Austrians that were more pressured countering Ottoman power, there wasn't a full cooperation between the two branches of the Habsburgs, that's just another story. But the 30 Years' War is a good example of it, because, as you know, during the same time, the 80 Years' War was being fought, that intertwines with, in fact, the German affairs, because the Netherlands, fundamentally the United Provinces, as they were born, were fundamentally the only case of secession from the Holy Roman Empire up to then. I mean, they technically belonged to it. So, and we tend to forget that, saying, well, but, Flanders were another thing, right? They weren't. Technically were part of the empire, just as, say, Bohemia, the Italian states, etc. And this aspect, in my opinion, gets often overlooked, but we'll skip that for now. In any case, the Spanish had found this way, right, of concentrating this dramatic amount of force in volunteer units, like the tercios, that were thousands of men strong, very often understrength. There were something around 3,000 on paper, but then this was also, given we're talking of manpower, the age of chronic understrength. As you know, not that previous times had been better, but the certain resources here would be very stretched, considering what was at stake, how long the war went on, also the geographical dimension, etc. The Spanish had been tactically the first army that had managed to create pike and shot warfare, right? Gonzalo de Cordoba, el Gran Capitan, is undoubtedly the greatest commander in modern history. He created modern warfare alone. He stopped, as you know, at Cerignola with pike and shot. The strength of French cavalry at that point had still dominated the battlefields after all, right? The Swiss had lacked the shot, right? So they didn't really go by combined arms. Also, their victories against the Burgundians were, say, not just luck, but you do need also a lot of luck in warfare. It was surely well played, but as you know, by the time of the Italian wars, the Swiss were cut out. Fortunately for them, right? Because the successful Switzerland that we know is also a product of Marignano, right? And the Battle of Blood, the Swiss pikemen, because if they had taken Milan, they would have had a completely different history. It would have been sucked into something completely else, right? The Spanish had this sense of, aggressiveness in themselves at the beginning of the Renaissance. They were famed for their rodelleros, for their assault infantry that would, however, relatively die out. And they maintained the highest standard of discipline, for which technically you were not even punished for deserting, because it was such a great honor to be part of the tercio that nothing else mattered. Like, if you abandoned it, you were doomed just in terms of reputation forever. And as you know, Spanish military culture spread throughout, especially the Catholic world. Like the German, the Catholic German, the Italian armies were very affected by this. The Landsknecht's flamboyant fashion was actually Spanish, right? Even though it became characteristic and also of German culture per se. Some Italian noblemen that would become famous in the history of warfare, such as Raimondo Montecuccoli, that was the milestone in military theory between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz, and that also saved Vienna before the 1683, 20 years before the 1683 siege, would begin as the noblemen, because technically the hidalgos in Spain were meant to be that, right? And as noblemen, this guy was, say, something more of a nobleman, but at least in the Italian in imperial hierarchy, would start as a humble pikeman. It was, of course, supervised by the officers, the relatives. They were noblemen, of course, very detached from, not just the camp life, but the troop or living in it, or serving as a pikeman. But you had to start that, because Spanish forces, again, the hidalgos, 1/3 of the male population, surely were not knights, mounted knights, etc., aside from the fact that, of course, cavalry had shrunk, but it had not disappeared. So these were noblemen, but on foot. And this was something that started, think about the Frundsberg in Pavia, or, like, there are lots of other great names in early modern warfare that showed this attitude because of what had been the Spanish model. The other and novel power that emerged during the 30 Years' War, that you can say these guys were really something in terms of military quality, au pair with Spanish, likely, were the Swedish regulars. Right, Sweden was at this point a quite modest power, but it had been massively, subsidized by France, that created, as such, the Swedish army that began to operate in the Baltic and then eventually in Germany up to Bavaria. As you know, the parabola of Gustavus Adolphus and also his tragic demise is all connected to this, creating a hell of an army that I also discussed in some of my videos, that in many ways, like, the entire myth that even Maurice of Nassau or Gustavus Adolphus literally reformed, introduced some genial concepts that, they invented personally, or even they were introduced in their armies at the time, is largely myth, right? It's actually a Protestant myth, even, that doesn't correspond to what actually happened. The reason why their armies were so successful is that they were good armies for the time, right? They had substantial resources to be fielded. They had certain political motivations. That the Dutch were fighting for their independence. The Swedish were a primitive but compact country that recruited. Think about also the reforms of Oxenstierna, etc. The troops from the same village, they cared about the sense of themselves, of the Swedish crown, of their faith, right, of the Protestant struggle against the Catholics, etc. And that made a lot of experience. Right? How many sieges did Maurice of Nassau win? Against how many enemies Gustavus Adolphus fought? Right? The coming back of cavalry, for example, is something attributable to the experience against the Polish hussars. Right? The increase of firepower, the various systems to deliver an ever greater amount of fire volume in a functional, orderly way on the battlefield. It's something that everybody was toying with, right? There are some specifics about, Maurice of Nassau's ideal reforms that actually the Spanish were practicing at the same time. There is a general tendency during the 30 Years' War, also during the English Civil War, to simply reduce and drastically so the importance of the pike, as you know, and this all started from experience. Well, not on what were already written as military treatises based on the Greeks and the Romans, armies, etc., but on actual experience. That was started being coupled with this theoretical intuitions that, however, were very far from having a substantial positive application, if not as drill manuals or something that, however, was in a sense the last of problems, rather finding the amount of resources to keep training troops, right? Not teaching them simply in a mental way what they had to do. So the problems, as we're saying, that really belong to somewhere else. It's not a military one. It's resolved at least through many others. So yeah, I think the Spanish and the Swedes were the best troops of the 30 Years' War. But they were closely followed by the French, but also the Italian troops. This is also a very overlooked aspect. The French, as we explained before, really had a hell of a military culture by this point. They had historically really always had. Right. The point, though, is that the French had always despised large infantry forces because such a populated and large country like France, if in fact inhabited by some veterans with belligerence instances, could have been quite a headache for the monarchy that had already been through the Jacquerie, their own confessional wars between, as you know, the 16th and the 17th century. Things that the French nobility didn't want to see repeated, but also the power of the monarchy was increasing, and so more forces were being brought in these theaters. The French invasion of the Rhineland was, of course, a big deal. Was really the force of a big country at the time, and with again disciplinary standards were in French military culture and would remain pretty high, right? Now the Italians that served fundamentally as they served as imperial subjects or Spanish subjects, sometimes both, in the sense that at least Lombardy, for example, was ruled by the Spanish but still an imperial fief, and since both Spain and the Empire were ruled by the Habsburgs, of course, there was an agreement on how to handle the matter. Were highly civilized places, right? The Spanish domination of Italy was actually a positive period compared to what at least the nationalistic ideas of it really were. It was a greatly expansive phase. The Milanese kept producing their armor, etc., that admittedly at this point was running out of importance. But generally speaking, they were well-trained forces, right? If you look at also great commanders, think about the Spinola, the Savoys, there were really great names associated to the Catholic successes of the 30 Years' War that bore an Italian name and carried out also by Italian troops. the Sardinians against the Neapolitans, the Lombards did behave well, right? Their standards were good for these time being, right? And because they were part, especially of the Spanish system that, as we've seen, had quite high military standards that were being able to be transferred to the peninsula as well. There were literally tercios of these other nationalities as others, right? Burgundians and most Germans came next, right? These also, some, especially the Catholic lands in Germany, as you know, were richer, more advanced, so tendentially they had the better standards, also from a military point of view. Consider that the experience of the 30 Years' War threw around this stereotype that the Germans were fundamentally a meek people because, say, armies from everywhere had been marching across their country, making a mess, destroying, raping, whatever, with all the devastating results that could be observed. And objectively, there is here a gap, right, that Germany as a whole had towards countries like France, Spain, that mirror the difficulties that the Habsburgs really had in evolving essentially from a feudal monarchy into a modern state, which happened fairly late in time, right? The true big affirmation of, say, countries like Austria or Prussia in the history of warfare would occur in the 18th century, with the great statal reforms that necessarily accompanied them that prior to that had not been possible. I mean, think about Prussia. Frederick II said that Siberia was actually a more advanced place than the Prussian hinterland. So there are a lot. Austria notoriously took off after the success of Prince Eugene against the first of all the victory at Vienna, but after that, right, this follow up against the Ottomans. And so it's much later from this. I made actually lots of videos regarding the situation around the 1683 siege of Vienna, and you've seen the enormous difficulties just to put together forces. This is the problem, as always, throughout military history. Not just, of course, the quantity, but also the quality. But in certain circumstances, in times in which, again, there aren't massive, say, structural differences between, say, within Europe, like in this case, we just highlight the differences because they are important. But as we were saying before, European warfare was dramatically homogeneous at this point. Quantity does play a very important role, and the Habsburgs had always to somehow consult the various estates, the nobility, everything was about this. You must give me a certain amount of troops in exchange for, so in order to avoid me billeting the troops I already have in your own territory. That's mostly and literally how the modern state was born. I also made a video about the French dragonnades, still under Louis XIV. This is essentially before the final revocation of the Edict of Nantes, when there were still Protestants in France, and simply given that there were no permanent barracks or a system just to host them, like the French soldiers would be in fact allowed to enter the houses, the communities of the Protestants and living off of them, literally. So that's the level of brutality. And I mean, if you know what happened in Germany during the 30 Years' War, you're really not shocked by anything, at that point. The English that also participated in some numbers to the 30 Years' War were also not that bad, frankly. I think they are the same level, more or less, of this, say, the Burgundians and most of the Germans. And they maybe just close behind, because the English, again, up to the new model army, didn't have, they were lagging behind the continent. There is absolutely no doubt about this. They were still thinking, even at least some of them, just at the beginning of the war using longbows and etc. But the main problem, of course, was what had triggered the same war. That is to say, the ship money was issued by was at least say tried to be imposed by Charles I, who wanted to make war with Spain with a decent army that, of course, the country would not provide. And so the entire thing brought to, as you know, the two revolutions that basically bring to the decuplication of actually the resources that the Britain needed, right, to go out war in that sense, to really make the British army the one that we know by the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th, the age of Marlborough, etc. So really when, the English had gapped at that point the distance. We will talk about 18th century warfare in that way, in that time as well. Then Walloons, Flemings, Dutch, etc. These were not that great forces for the simple reason that, in part, as we've seen, they were either very gentrified. The Dutch would create a mercenary army. They didn't want to say that they were okay with fighting it at sea, but not on land. And the Walloons, other places in Flanders, were a bit like that, either very bourgeois to a degree, or very feudal in lands that had not constituted a solid, let's say, political compaction, like as opposed to certain German states, for example, that were more state-like, also as far as the military organization was concerned. So this is my list, actually, that I think is interesting to discuss. In any case, all the powers that we listed had a core of forces that were superior to most other feudal levies. In other words, all of them had, of course, a degree of statal forces. They had uniformed, drilled. When I say uniformed, doesn't mean, again, that they were... there is no such thing like perfect standardization, not even today. As a matter of fact, you can customize your equipment, etc. But what I mean is that, of course, that especially drilled and through substantial resources that could allow to carry out more complex maneuvers, forces run by, commanded by the polity, like the government, whichever it was, right? And yes, there were lots of feudal levies still around. As we were saying, you visit this land in 200 years before, it were the Middle Ages, right? And not much had changed objectively. Actually, these were terrible times. There's been lots of wars. Some countries had even, fallen compared to prior times and so on, or split, etc. Because of all these dynastic issues as well that complicated the situation, and that mostly reflected, however, the scarcity of resources locally. Of course, other troops could be put to good service. The Austrian Habsburgs, for example, recruited Croat light cavalry from their estates. Right? You know that they had the Krajina, that is the frontier, that in Slavic is like Ukraine, like the concept that there is a border of some sort. We find pretty much everywhere. In those, in fact, frontier areas, that as frontier areas were ravaged by troops coming also from everywhere. In that case, the Ottomans could summon like the Tartars from Crimea, even, I don't know, Arab cavalry. We know of Indian forces that at some point were sent because of the Ottoman Mughal alliance against the Safavids of Persia, that even brought some Indian troops fighting in the Balkans, in Central Europe. Or if not so, if I remember correctly, but in the Ottoman army for sure. So there surely were on that front as well. So made lots of videos about steppes warfare. You know that the Serbs, the Croats were mostly under under Austria at this point, while at least they were frontier Serbs from the other side, but there was a lot of guerrilla. Think about the Idoks paid by the Venetians and the Habsburgs against the Turks. And this exotic way of fighting, very reminiscent again of the steppes of the East, broadly meant, was pretty damn good. Like all those, the Hussars, the Uhlans, the concept of the dragon, of the dragoon itself was coming from this broader East. As you know, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had a lot of that as well. And in the 18th century, they would become, at this point, separated mostly from their ethnic origin, aside from these areas of Central and Eastern Europe that really could draw it from the spring. Certain specialized types of troops, right? That, in fact, took the name from this somehow Turco-Mongolian tradition. This was going on from a long time. Think about the stratiots used back in the day. There is a continuity here in this fashion, and needless to say, light cavalry was used to ravage the enemy, to say instate this war of attrition that is somehow out there at this point, where everything was so complicated from a logistical point of view. Sieges took forever. You had this dramatic fragmentation, all the political issues of passing through this or that little German state, territory, how was it aligned, whatever. And this tradition is very old, actually. It dates back to the time, I don't know, the Habsburgs and the Arpads fielded Kuman horsemen against the Bohemians, the Battle of Markfeld of 1278. Central Europe is that close to the steppe. Technically, there is the steppe there in part too. So these forces were quite characteristic of these places, and of course the atrocities that followed were really, I mean, on the Habsburg Ottoman frontier, roasting or scorching a person alive was seemingly very, very popular. Not that, as well, say, Western Europeans were particularly more sensitive for that matter, but there are also some manners somewhere. These light cavalrymen, the Habsburgs brought on the German battlefields, proved so effective that other armies, such as the French, soon copied the practice. The dragonnades that I was talking about before have to do with this, some sort of imitation of steppe savagery. That is something that leads up to, William II is the one who threw around the thing that the Germans were Huns, right? It's not anti-German British propaganda. It's literally, the Second Reich's emperor that wants the Germans to consider themselves as brutally devoid of any trace of human scruple, just like the Huns, because that's what they're going for. And this is, of course, a reminiscence of these legacies, right? We see them now after 100 years saying, oh my God, this is such an issue. Well, I don't know. Look at what 100 years before that the world really was, and you will understand much more about today as well, as always. The recruitment of prisoners was common, and surprisingly enough, sometimes worked as well. Mercenaries tended to vary with their background and contract holder. As we'll see now, confessional issues were not this big of a deal. Think about the Lutheran Landsknechts in the same Charles V army. This is like the policies don't say, don't ask, don't tell, right? It was about money largely. Not that the confessional aspect did not play a role, right? But this is the age of Descartes as well. That was a French officer in the 30 Years' War, and so you can also appreciate this double say this turning towards the inner aspect, the spiritual side, as opposed to Caesar's one, that probably created important tensions to these people. The leaders especially were very convinced, like the chiefs, the nobility, that there was a specific sense of a specific code, a specific value that was not different from the one of medieval times, in spite of the best efforts to make us think that a modern age ever existed. Right? This was just a long Middle Ages. The Middle Ages stopped sometime between 1792 and 1918. Remember that. I will make a video soon about Scottish infantry, but not the mercenaries of the 30 Years' War, but the ones fighting in Britain, still during this period. But as you know, there were lots of mercenaries from the Celtic fringe, for example, in Swedish service, that would be virtually indistinguishable from the Swedes in that case, because they were equipped with the best gear, which is also fascinating, because you often see them like, these guys fought still with the longbow, with the double-handed swords, whatever. But the truth is that not only they knew how to operate very well the most updated technologies, but they often fought. Somebody else's service would provide them with, as long as they stayed in their service. So you couldn't quite distinguish that. This would remain true also for the armies of the 18th century. Like how many French or Poles or Italians you would find, I don't know, in Frederick the Great's army, right? Or renegades, scumbag of the world. Like, think about the political exiles, common criminals that went to fight in the Zaporizhia islands with the Cossacks, right? Again, Europe was really, that interconnected already. Mercenaries had to be paid regularly, or they had a disconcerting tendency to desert or even to go on strike just before a crucial battle. But with regular pay and decent treatment, mercenaries and impressed prisoners of war were remarkably loyal. This was obvious, right? Mercenaries are out there, and especially they have this centrality de facto in these armies. Let's be honest, like the core of these armies was mercenary in nature, because they worked, right? Because they got the thing done. Yes, they could be unloyal, but national levies could be unloyal as well. At least if they deserted, if they just were dispirited, if they didn't see the purpose of keeping on fighting. That's all something that you must, of course, take into consideration. We have this romantic myth reinforced in the 19th century with roots in Machiavelli, etc., that the mercenary, just per se, is just an immoral person. But first of all, they are soldiers, right? So the notion of mercenary is also debatable as a term, because what does that mean exactly, right? Didn't other people get paid to do what they needed to, right? They all paid they all paid something to be there in the first place, but also were paid in some way. So you can't quite agnostically distinguish the things, without mentioning that mercenaries were also sometimes of the same nationality for the one of the forces they were serving. In the first place, the rulers that were serving. So this is part of the game, as we were saying before. The command posts, the subcontracting of the regimental levies and so on were all going through, say, the realm's hierarchy, right? Through the national nobility, etc. And in many ways, there could be issues at that level. And the confessional struggle made it even more evident, because in the same countries there were Catholics as Protestants. We didn't have a country where everybody was just, Catholic or just Protestant. Especially, I think the exception is Italy. Like, that's the only country which, at least, there was never a war of religion whatsoever. But basically, in all the rest of Europe, you knew as a sovereign that there was somebody against your own confession in your own very national army, which is fascinating. Maybe they were even fighting better than some other, because evidently that religious difference was not everything, at least to that extent. The mercenaries, of course, were pretty brutal people, because they being disconnected with, let's say, from the institution, right? Being dependent on some warlord, or having, say, being less traceable, serving there as just, again, someone was evidently not somewhere else that you can control, and being experienced men of war, so having all a specific psychological profile of the veteran of wars like the 16th to 17th century. Well, now we were talking about atrocities before. That's something, again, that's why I told you to read certain books, because the level of brutality here, aside from the propaganda from both sides that, of course, tended to magnify, to demonize, whatever, and that's something you have to respect, because it's still a way to make politics, still a way to make war, and if it succeeds, you should ask yourself something about your side, right? Because only superior cultures win in this regard, like a parity of conditions. So it's something you have to answer there. The actual level of massacres, raping, people burnt alive, all the kind of niceties that you can imagine about this context were carried out really frequently, and mostly by the mercenaries that were just, again, in terms of mindset, more habituated to do so. The 30 Years' War opened to a sense that the atrocities paid during this war were so great that basically we still leave, in fact, at least to some, to what in the Westphalian, post-Westphalian world, which is a concept I'm not entirely, I'm a Clausewitzian. I don't really believe that war was, say, in the West was categorically something like Westphalian, pre-Westphalian. I think it's actually a pretty superficial and militarily and politically literate way of looking at history in the first place. But it's obvious that, at least when we get things on an objective level, that there was a great effort to regularize, at least, the army's behavior from the political authority in a way that would spare, say, the greatest amount of suffering to civilians. This would happen for just the consideration that countries had for one another, the very particular balance that was forming. Also, aside from the 30 Years' War that just accelerated it, but that looked at European countries trying to keep things a bit more fixed at home and just concentrated mostly in the colonies, and or trying to dissuade the enemy from carrying out a war of destruction that in such ever more intertwined continent would have still had negative consequences on the entire system. Also because it was really not worth it, right? Still, wars were seen as an aristocratic sport. They would be seen so for most of the 18th century. Still, armies increased in size, and the populace kept paying, right? But the political end was not necessarily creating this fractures between a country and another that would prevent at that point a negotiable peace of some sort for very specific objectives, very specific, I don't know, territorial acquisitions or whatever. War remained incredibly brutal, but there were substantial efforts for a more regulated type that would at least spare the civilians a substantial amount of suffering like the ones that had been seen before. And this surely passed through the increase in control on the same armies. So the fact that mercenaries were less responsible here, were acting a bit on their own, created the juridical precondition, say, for them to be a bit, less lawful for these international conventions that were gradually being established. And so it was, as we've seen, this same sovereign's interest to create ever more centralized states, just to have more power and managing things more and more effectively in the first place. And when you look at, again, confessional divisions, you realize that these were not really what would make the difference in that regard. There were, in fact, many Protestants serving in Catholic armies, and indeed, at the terrible sack of Magdeburg of May the 20th, 1631, they gleefully joined in murdering, robbing, raping, and torturing those of their own religion. It's a bit like the sack of Rome in 1527. You would expect the Lutheran Germans to just commit the greatest atrocities. Well, some of that definitely did, but it seems that the Catholic Spanish were actually wars, which also creates reputation problems, creates political issues. Right? Charles V, that was celebrating the birth of his heir Philip, at that point declared this a tragedy, and obliged everybody to dress black. So the sack of Magdeburg weighed on, say, Protestant powers as much as, of course, Protestants did participate in the murdering, and people knew that. And so this, was bringing the world a bit more upside down even than Baroque art is showing you. So these were dramatic moments. The extensive use of mercenaries led to an unusual phenomenon in 17th century warfare. That is, the further development and the unprecedentedly so of the military entrepreneur / businessman. This was a man who actually owned whole regiments, being responsible for arming, recruiting, and training them. Essentially, he was a businessman who rarely led the troops in combat, preferring to leave that to his lieutenant colonel. As you understand, this was quite remunerative, at least in theory, meaning that what was quite remunerative by the 17th century was something miserable. I made a video about Al-Farake that describes the miserable, the sorrow life of these soldiers and lieutenant colonels, that case in the Spanish army, that makes you really see how these people were always essentially serving for bare survival, right? Even within the hierarchy, lieutenant colonel or these businessmen were always under somebody else. And they had to basically sacrifice everything in order to get favors from the top, so hoping to advance. And so everything was really dramatic. Just from a psychological point of view, it must have been terrible, but still, like in a miserable world like that one, the few that could be earned from it was enough to create this big push, even for soldiers to be... soldiers were at some point even forced into enlistment, but let's say people, generally speaking, to participate to the business as a whole. There were exceptions, like when you look at Wallenstein, the power achieved by this man and made a video about him made him, first of all, the most successful businessman of the time. He not only owned whole regiments, but of course also ammo, uniform, and ration manufactories. Enjoying even a good battle and often getting personally involved, that brought to some of the most important Catholic successes of the 30 Years' War was this overall management. It's as if Wallenstein had owned like a sort of state on his own, right? This is what, as we explained, was the case already for a country like Germany that was essentially like 300 statelets altogether. But here we're talking about something much larger, something that could even hope to hegemonize Germany. At a point, Wallenstein was eventually taken out by a plot. The entire game was very political, as you understand, because he turned at some point even against the same Emperor Ferdinand II, or at least as it happens in all these situations, there were very active negotiations from all sides, right, to bring these figures from one side or the other. But that's the point. Like the business model, as we were noticing for the Dutch before, was bringing on the table new means just to organize the armies themselves, how to supply them. And if you had a single purpose, you owned the resources, right, and the wealth, the influence, the charisma to channel them towards a single purpose, you could definitely score a big hit, right? It's not, again, just about having resources, it's also how you use them, right? And still, most of these enterprises turn into disasters, as you understand. Recruiting methods, assuming one did not use mercenaries, varied, as we were noticing, from country to country. The Spanish, and apparently their Austrian Habsburg cousins, used a sort of subcontractor approach, in which a man was authorized to raise a certain number of troops in a particular region. They went by that because they needed the men from somewhere, right? So, as we will see now, manpower, still in the 17th century, we're in pre-industrial times, you don't have major, infinite demographic resources, and still these are somebody else's people often, or at least they work for others. So if you ship them to Flanders or somewhere else, you're going to cause a damage locally, right? The will of the individual is not important, of course. This was the scum of the earth. You just bit the shit out of them until you turned them into completely different things, namely killing machines that would remain wired like that throughout all their lives with trauma, etc., because they could only be soldiers at that point. Lesser people have never been important. Here we're talking about politics, about the elite, right? Who's willing to just, have thousands of troops from a given region to be levied. It's not even single figures sometimes. It's just the entire mechanism. The local communities, the representatives, the estates, etc. And so how they can play internally. So in this Spanish case, the subcontractor was marching back and forth across the region to literally fish these people because they were hiding, as you understand. He tried to con them into the army. But this could only work well when and where there was a surplus of labor, as you understand. Sometimes it was propitious, sometimes there weren't many resources. In times of famine, etc., again, the local communities were not that thrilled to give that more. And in fact, as time and the war went on, think about the carnage of the Netherlands, but the fact that Spain was involved all around the world, Spanish manpower resources grew slim. Indeed, there was a problem of that kind. It was not the only one. Admittedly, other countries had similar problems, but still, Spain was not overly populated just per se, so you had to care about that too. Nevertheless, this system was essentially maintained throughout the Habsburg realms for the entire war, and was adopted by others as well, because objectively it's the most effective. You try to dilute a bit, like you pick a region where this is more feasible, and you try to roam it, to recruit troops from, say, scattered communities, not to be too oppressive on this or that other. It would be all a political negotiation going on. As we're noticing before, the Swedes developed instead the most sophisticated recruiting system, one much that of even late 19th century Europe, at least as far as the role of the communities of the district, say of the militias, was involved. Sweden was, in fact, if we've seen it, made a video on this, into a number of territorial regimental areas known as Landsregiment, each of which conscripted 1 man in 10 from among those 16 through 44 for part-time service in peace and full-time service in war, when the depot spun off 3 field regiments. And actually there were communities that paid a great price throughout, let's say, the Swedish adventures overseas, so that it was still costly, but it had the advantage of being, first of all, directed entirely by the monarchy, that had now a control on it. Didn't one advantage of Sweden is that since the country had not been developing particularly historically, right, there wasn't much between the monarchy and the people. Not to say that, of course, there wasn't a nobility or that there weren't contractors and stuff like that, but generally speaking, it was simpler to handle such a system because it was much less complicated. Say that, think about all the institutions that existed, the estates, the privileges, the intricacies, the complications in the Holy Roman Empire, right? Admittedly, that was also a much larger country, so it was much more complicated to make everybody agree. It was utopistic. That's why they fought the 30 Years' War in the first place. While Sweden was more compact, she had after all, some specific goals, was being subsidized dramatically for her military build-up. She had, famously enough, a fine arms production because of the raw material that would contribute, in fact, much to this, also to the arms exports, etc. So she was really well placed to even provide the conscripts with an adequate amount of training, environment, and just testing them on a prolonged time to establish also a sense of nationhood in the process. And evidently the country was fighting for purposes that seemed like politically viable, right? They saw it from essentially their own regional perspective, and they simply went for it because it was all one country without those divisions, right, that were present in much larger ones as we've been just seeing. And when especially things are supposed to be part of a single system, like the imperial one, for example, and especially in Germany, that was at a national scale, in spite of the wide differences between the same Germans, but still having to do with that set of federal customs that had been the entire point of negotiation, because the country was, yes, fragmented politically, but it was one land. It was reachable. It was the reason. Part of the reason why this war was fought, of course, was the fact that it was possible to compact Germany under a single rule. And as you know, during the first phase, the Catholics had basically achieved that, right? Seemed to have been done for good. Swedish cavalry was supplied by the conscription of horses and their owners, and supplemented by aristocratic volunteers. So there was a compaction also in this extraction. It worked quite well. It was the basis for Swedish military supremacy during the middle period of the war, regardless of the recruiting methods. Once one had in his recruits, he had to turn them into soldiers, which is always the next step, right? This is not so easy as we think today, or at least, let's say, in an operational, say, in a qualitative sense, meaning that teaching, say, training troops is something. Even in the best country in the world, fighting a war, like the experience you're gathering from battlefield, is much more precious than any of that training, right? At least in a proportional way. And this, of course, comes only if you have some war going on that provides you with that insight. As we were saying at the beginning, technology of the 30 Years' War was rather primitive, and just by basic strategic education, technology alone is zero, right? Doctrine is everything. There were, of course, some technological improvements during the war, mostly continued this much broader development from essentially, the increase, at least in the performance of muskets. We can't say a technological improvement in this regard, bringing to the decay of the pike, which is not entirely a matter of, again, performance. It's also operational in nature, right? Because this prolonged war was highlighting certain campaign necessities that were not experimented to the same intensity before, with the same political and social conditions, for the various participants. In any case, it was evident that on campaign, during the march, but in combat, etc., the pike was becoming more of an hindrance than anything, right? It would be the tendons, right, in the background. Then, of course, the pike, but also cold steel, also among the infantry, was very much there. Cavalry was actually coming back from quite a while now, from the end of the 16th century, after the contraction of the mid, and so things were, as always changing. We may not, of course, say things change today much faster, because the systems are much bigger. But at the time, of course, these changes were noticed, also from a doctrinal point of view. Siege warfare is a greatly overlooked chapter of the 30 Years' War, because, of course, there were very important battles that could really make the difference. Tens of thousands of men clashing, and if destroying the enemy, managing to pour into their forces into large theaters, destroying, ravaging, as we've seen, not even just necessarily managing to conquer, but still with great damage, and this costs really a lot. When we look at the complexity of the training, however, we realize that this was overall very complex, right? That 21st century recruit doesn't go through more difficult things than they did at the time. Pike fighting, for example, was quite complex. At least fencing was really wild. because it was about the mass and not the individual. But that's the point, right? Maintaining an order. By the way, under enemy fire, because that's the point. Like the pike still existed because in open field that counted as heavy infantry, and musketry fire was not enough to thin satisfactorily the pikemen's ranks, so that the musketeers could simply maintain the ground. So it was basically about that. So it was very attritional. It was very rudimentary in the say tactical at a tactical unit level. At least in appearance, like the movements were slow, there weren't dramatic maneuvers, but still it was a very sophisticated type of warfare in of itself. And maintaining the order in such circumstances, of course, was paramount. The complexities also of loading, aiming, and firing the musket or arquebus while counter-marching, well, that was also quite of a challenge. It's only at this point that this large amount of troops start performing maneuvers like these, and in a combined arms fashion that had never been seen before, because firearms were not new evidently for that time, but this was the greatest development ever seen at the time, and nobody had ever known how things were supposed to happen at a collective level. The problems of loading a pistol while charging at the trot, right, were all just as difficult to learn in their way as the field stripping of an assault rifle, right? If not more, actually, because, of course, different troops would do different things. There were more specialized troops, more professional ones, etc. But doing it, right, and having the sense of relying on others, having them trained for the purpose, etc., was incredibly difficult, right? And with much less means that we have today, overall, just even to understand each other. Consider that, of course, the 17th century artillerymen did not have electronic calculators or computers to help out trajectories, or satellite vision to know what was going on behind play. Of course, there were ways to know that, but in fact, they were more, say, not less expensive, evidently, because we have all that basis today. Because there is a historical process. Things are not necessarily going to be that easy. But it's all something that you must learn of empirically. That's what also stimulated treatises being written for the first time in these topics. Because of the complexity reached by the tactical implications of the same. Because we would write like a treatise of how to use a 14th century gun. Doesn't make any sense. Now, there weren't, of course, logarithms or slide rules or a standard measure of distance. That was also another issue. Imagine, an English soldier informing a German crewman that the foe were but a mile off, right? The Englishman might be quavering in his boots, while the German would be taking his heels, for a German mile was equivalent to 4.5 English miles, right? This, of course, was the least of the problems. But the aforementioned heterogeneity of armies created these issues. The fact that maybe you did manage to put together enough troops, but then you had, of course, to train them in a way that had to surpass language barriers, stuff like that, right? This is the moment in which, if you all fight, in the sense, from all over Europe in a place like Germany, there is also, for example, a military language that is going to get Germanized to an unprecedented extent, especially for these, say, for not only, right, but think about the intensity of this war. There were easier, like, again, those who had a more developed system had things really easier. Spain, for example, at least tried, because they did not always have time, and that's also by itself just a huge factor strategically. How long can you train your troops, even if you have the best contractors, right? Well, Spain tried to give her records a year in the ranks in a quiet area like Italy. Sweden more or less tried for the same thing at home. And with that kind of experience, it again is nothing compared to what you're going to have on the battlefield in a war zone. A man was at least ready to take on the field in a mechanical way that would really perform in action. This is quite interesting. We've seen it even on 18th century Prussian warfare regarding, for example, how after the first volleys, it's not much that they didn't literally see anything because of the smoke in front of them, because until the 19th century simply there weren't the chemicals to prevent that fog to fall after the first volley. But literally the synchronization of the soldiers shooting, of the lines shooting, of the actual postures, especially when being under enemy fire, would prevent this mechanism to maintain any order. And the troops were literally trained compulsively to shoot as fast as they could. Because in a way it was still about a sort of zone, let's say, at least they aimed at a night where they, and at that direction, of course, when they hoped to hit the enemy. But at that point, it was mostly about how much you could enter this sort of trance by shooting repeatedly without even seeing what's in front of you, because you had to be habituated to the mechanism of starting shooting like hell, because that's actually the best thing you can hope for on the battlefield, as opposed to taking more time or trying to remain more orderly, but not pouring enough on the enemy that sees as much as you do. That is nothing, practically, after the first shot. So this mechanism is fundamental, because it's not even about the technical result. It's about the moral, let's say, the mindset, the habituation to sounds, to the mess, to the chaos. This is crucial. Of course, it was not even always possible to give a man proper training. As time went on, the veteran cadres upon which such training depended were depleted, by the way, because at least losses were heavy. For Spain, the overwhelming French victory at Rocroi on May the 16th, 1649, destroyed the solid core of the Spanish infantry for generations to come. The Tercio was not over, but the Spanish army in that theater, fundamentally was, and of course, in different times, the Spanish could have sent something else, but of course, it was also another type of war that was being made politically. So that's one thing. The French, as we've seen, had been progressing steadily in the consolidation of a hell of an army after the periods of civil war and after having lost Italy. So pretty heavy blows for the French monarchy. And yet they had that enormous potential that not even Spain had at that point, and in fact it would rise to hegemonic power in a few decades. So it may be wise to say something about the men themselves. Then, as now, the common soldier was young. About 2/3 of the men in most units were between 17 and 30. With much of the balance in their 30s and 40s. Occasionally, one would find an ancient veteran of 70 or 80 still shouldering a pike, but definitely wasn't the standard. Most of the men came from the lower class background. As we've seen, the Spanish particularly liked to have one or two aristocrats in every infantry company to improve the tone, to boost the morale, and still showing that, say, nobility was a matter of character rather than, say, which place they had on the battlefield, not exactly the first line, together with the humble final rank soldier, right, to spirit them. This had been, again, the deal from quite a while. So, I don't know, Emperor Maximilian I had given the example. In that way, we remember Frundsberg and Pavia, etc. These people were, say, their social background was really miserable, and that's how they were mostly chosen, of course, aside from the fact that they had to be able. Many of the troops had useful civil skills. They were mostly peasants, so they knew how to live out there. But it wasn't just about the scum, right? There was a good percentage of people already at the time who were able to read and write, which is not a few, right? Also for this broader, I don't know, small unit organization needs and self-subsistency, etc. Of course, much more physical and mental and other mental capacities were needed to deal with war, but the war was growing in other ways too. And needless to say, life expectancy was rather short, right? And battle probably caused fewer casualties than hunger, and surely even less than disease. So this was typical. It would remain typical for centuries, as you know. So you can imagine the attritional rate, the casualties. Again, we're talking about understrength units, and I made videos describing also the organic evolution that was based on this depletion. At some point, different units were put together to form. So the nomenclature is sometimes confusing, but the point was reaching that sort of company and brigade functionality tactically that could not be obtained simply by the numbers, the understrength numbers that were chronically available for the units as they were ideally conceived, right? So that from this, other unit sizes were established, other terms used mostly. We will see this better also in another video. And it's important to stress how used these people were to death in general. I mean, just child mortality was very high, so chances were that you had been brought up in families where normally you had seen siblings being buried. You would just banally, I mean, you would say, what does this have to do with it? But the fact that there was no... Think about the starry sky at night, right? Today we barely see that in cities. With these people mostly were brought up in the countryside. They had a completely different vision of the world. If anything, just from an environmental point of view. They had much more concrete concepts of faith, at least in the traditional meaning of course, especially the lower social classes didn't have much of a theological grasping, but they were much more acquainted to the issues of the moral issues, and how these were, interplaying in everyday life to a very different degree than our own. At least they were very poor. First of all, their life was precarious. So death was surely prevalent everywhere as a figure. You see it also from art, from literature. There is a constant. I made videos about this too, of course. Reference to the misery of military life, also in a sort of hypercritical sense regarding the trick of, say, the idea that somebody would go at war for seeking glory and then they wouldn't get any of that. Of course, this is a complex topic that I won't treat here, because in many ways this was true more meaningful for an elite individual, for aristocrats that were probably mostly the target of that kind of times also of criticism, right? And that was not understood by lower classes that evidently suffered of war, but they didn't have very clear mind why these wars were being fought. Not that they weren't participating actively to them, even in contributing for them to happen. But there was already this sort of populistic idea, of course, that it's the evil guys at the top and the rest of the people are so naive, right? And it's BS, right? In many ways, just like today, it's gone increasing. Actually, those who were fighting those wars had a much more concrete idea of the necessity of such clash. And they were trying to make the world actually working better. So they mostly had, in order to remain in power, mostly had to adapt to a situation that was degenerating, as we've seen in the dimming of the sacred in the heart of man. I mean, this was a confessional war, so of course, again, the Reformation brought on the table incredibly, say, radical and, say, traditionally wise and impossible values to support from authorities like the universal ones for what they objectively still are supposed to mean, right? And the conviction that this would have been allegedly, this fragmentation would have been allegedly a positive thing, it's very difficult to support in the first place. One has to understand why it happened, definitely, but again, this is not to make relativism. No, there wasn't an evil side that was just imposing some sort of tortuous, obscurantistic, and primitive backwards mentality on the other, right? It was a very different problem. That is to say, what was good in other countries' political development was essentially hijacked by very opportunistic policies that were trying to gather less, say, on the long run and more in the short run, and essentially diluting, again, the sense of moral standard. And this is a complicated thing, of course, to explain, but I won't be doing it today. In any case, the acquaintance with that problem is what makes the era, the torment of conscience. You would think, again, how one would fight this war, right? This is the point. But such a terrible and devastating war. How was it born? Like, there were very, say, it's always seducing to make simplistic explanations, like it was just, again, a matter of profiting out of. That's not how wars are simply fought for, right? Nor there is a definitive way to even establish that's an explanation, actually. You must have to see it on much wider terms, that historians discuss, not because they're misguided, but not because they say we don't know, but because they are actually misguided regarding certain notions that were evident to them about the universal condition of man that today are simply skipped. And so it's obvious that the thing would appear strange or weird, but I mean, apparently it's become a problem even for historians to understand the logic of World War I, because people want to hear that. It's a way to market, right? It's a way, if you say that there were a bunch of few people were just a bunch of imbeciles that made all the other poor angels pay for it, I think you're very misguided. And the worst is that this concept is just resumed by others who want to support systems that are much more backward compared, of course, to the West, to not attribute instead the blame to leadership, which obviously does exist, or at least just the leadership that they want to blame, and turning, in fact, a blind eye to the others. So all the most intuitive and common and popular opinions about these topics are from all sides, right, are usually just garbage, to be honest, to be kind, telling the truth, and must be eradicated in a moral and scientific way, because that's the point in history where we truly do not understand how we make history anymore. That's an issue, but the being acquainted to death and killing especially, that's something which shapes you in a way that cannot also be reverted. Like there are ways and ways to withstand that, of course, which also I believe has much to do with actually a moral weakness of how people are brought up. But for them, it was something much more normal. Not that it was good or positive or they were neutral to it, but they would see much more closely the implications, the causes, right? They would understand why this thing was happening than we do, or that what we would like to pretend that they were doing. And this perception, I think, is quite crucial, because we start having diaries, notes, memory, really a lot about this era, and you can't really study what this world was about, and perceiving immediately what their mindset was, without being too sure that you have anything to add personally to that, and that you should actually just be silent and watch and say, be very very carefully wired to this whole. Now, we will keep talking about the 30 Years' War. This was just like a very short premise about mostly problems of armies, manpower. Then we will look at more technical issues, right? The equipment, the armament, stuff like that. But there is really a lot about the organization, the administration, and also operation, tactics. That's crucial, of course. Strategy, a bit perhaps just of the history of the war. But we will see it on another occasion. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.